Hello everyone and welcome back to my analysis of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless and tonight we're going to be taking a look at what I find to be one of the more interesting and generally less discussed aspects of PT, that being the radio and its various broadcasts. This section is going to primarily be a speculative piece, so I hope you forgive me for being less concrete in my analysis here, but honestly this might just be the most difficult to understand piece of the puzzle that was Silent Hills. Also, much like in the story section of this essay, I will be going into certain topics some may find difficult to talk about, as they are somewhat political in nature. This, however, will have less to do with the story itself, and more so how Kojima has presented his beliefs in games prior to and post-PT, and how I'm able to observe that as a member of his core audience. First things first, who the hell did they pick to voice this role? Because my god, this performance is outstanding, and whoever it was absolutely knocked it out of the park. But unfortunately, they're not credited.
Retrieved the rifle and shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch. When his 10-year-old son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too. His 6-year-old daughter had the good sense to hide in the bathroom, but reports suggest he lured her out by telling her it was just a game.
The broadcaster comes off as astute and exudes a strong confidence, but it's very off-putting when the guy starts referring to the little girl as having the good sense to hide in the bathroom, and how neighbors called 9/11. This guy switches from a schlocky Alex Jones parody to a sinister, almost Charles Manson-style cult leader vibe in an instant when comparing the standard broadcast to the radio interference. There's also just the slightest hint of vocal fry that hints to a certain degree of apathy to the stories he's reporting, further cementing the idea that this guy's a massive dick. And as if he wasn't enough of a dick already, he even taunts the player by goading them to look behind you. Well, any guess at who the voice actor might be is a complete shot in the dark. So I'm going to take that shot.
Taking hostages has been a part of human history since human history began. Oklahoma City.
You taking a trip, Wes?
And shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch.
I want you to take that 9mm out of your belt and put it in the van, slowly.
The Trade Center bombings.
I'm gonna give you 15 seconds to run for your life.
I said, look behind you.
876.
863.
876.
863.
Kind of scary on this end of the rifle, isn't it, Wes?
There's a whole new level of bad guy out there. A very complicated and dangerous and intelligent and prepared enemy.
You know, Wes, at least the people that you murdered died with their dignity.
I got a message for all you folks out there in Radio Land.
But in the last 15 years, there have been some big changes.
Meet David Caruso, well-renowned actor who first appeared in the 1980 film Getting Wasted, and eventually went on to become the leading man on the hit TV series CSI Miami, which went on for about 10 seasons, towards the end of which he was making as much as $375,000 per episode. Caruso had been nominated for a Primetime Emmy and even won himself a Golden Globe for his role on NYPD Blue. When CSI Miami ended in 2012, he retired from the world of acting and went on to pursue his interests in the art business. From what I can tell, the guy seems to be enjoying his retirement and pretty much doing whatever he wants. With all of that free time, especially in the immediate years of his retirement, who's to say he wasn't approached by a few casting agents? And who's to say he didn't say yes to at least one of them, especially if that something involved venturing into an entirely new artistic medium? Now okay, let me be clear. I'm not here to spread rumors, and I am not saying this happened. I am, however, saying that the possibility of it is there, and given that his voice is identical to the man on the radio, I'm inclined to raise an eyebrow at the potential reality of the situation. For now, this is the best I've got. Honestly, if I ever met Kojima, Del Toro, or anyone that ever worked on PT, my first question would be, who the hell's the man on the radio? So let's go through each of the radio broadcasts and try and make sense of what's going on here. The first broadcast references a congressional debate over gun control flaring up yet again and proceeds to discuss a series of horrific familicides, suggesting that even though the crimes are unrelated, they may be a part of some rising trend onset by a number of social issues. This is an obvious mirror to a certain real-world trend of crimes that had become quite prevalent in the US by the time of the game's conception. It's important to note that this is a common practice in the horror genre, and until it becomes a direct reflection, or worse, outright parody of real-world events, that it shouldn't be considered exploitative, as the connection won't necessarily be made by everyone. Evidence of this being that the game didn't get utterly lambasted by critics for doing just that. and the subject material is still being taken quite seriously. Another example of a work of horror that engaged in this practice is the first Nightmare on Elm Street film, which was heavily inspired by the stories of Asian refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam who suffered from horrific nightmares and eventually died in their sleep. During the conception of Freddy Krueger, Wes Craven actively avoided characterizing him as a child molester because he understood that the character didn't need that added onto his mountainous pile of crimes, and to do so would have been nothing but exploitative at that point. I admit, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when something becomes exploitative, and obviously anyone can have gripes with any kind of material, depending on the subject matter that it covers. But isn't that kind of the point of horror? To make the audience feel uncomfortable and feel anxious? PT succeeds in this regard because, like so many things in the opening minutes of the game, it serves to help immerse the player in the world of the game by making it feel more real and actualized than it otherwise would. But this doesn't just apply to anyone up to date on the news in the US. Anyone is capable of recognizing that familicide is an utterly horrific and appalling crime. When I was young, I wasn't familiar with the horror stories of what Asian refugees faced during their time in hiding, but I didn't need that in order to understand that dying in your sleep is utterly terrifying. The stories of the Asian refugees adds context, but it isn't necessary to be scared or made uncomfortable even by the film, so credit to PT for maintaining respect for its subject matter. The same, however, most certainly can't be said for This Man on the Radio. The man shows absolutely no respect for the victims of the crimes he's covering. Most news anchors wouldn't be so callous as to break up the tension of their report by referring to the little girl who was murdered as having the good sense to hide in the bathroom. He isn't being an outright asshole, but there's enough sour notes sprinkled into the man's monologue that anyone can get the impression that he is a pretty unlikable guy. It's pretty obvious that this character is intended to be a parody of conspiracy theorist personalities, which saw a shift into the mainstream media coverage and popularity around the early 2010s, the same time that Silent Hills was being conceptualized. Conspiracy theories have always been commonplace in the mass media, of course, and Kojima was obviously no stranger to them. More specifically, in the early 2010s, conspiracy theories were seeing something of a resurgence in popularity, to the point that entire conspiracy theory networks, such as InfoWars, were seeing something of a renaissance in viewership and followers. Conspiracism was also beginning to leak into the world of gaming, with channels such as Feminist Frequency suggesting that game studios were often seeking to undermine and demean women, people of color, and various divisions of the LGBT through subtle design choices in their games. Conspiracism was running rampant and beginning to become relevant to the world of gaming, so it makes sense that Kojima, who has always had an interest in the subject, would consider using it in his next potential title. Moving on to the Look Behind You puzzle, we hear the same broadcast that was heard in the first loop, but this time there's some discrepancies. There's a very prevalent static noise that fluctuates in intensity. When the static hits a peak, the broadcast will cut to the same man on the radio delivering subliminal messages such as, "You can't trust the tap water," and repeating the infamous number sequence 204863. At this point, it's pretty well decided by the Silent Hill community that the number itself is nothing more than a reference to Kojima's birthday, and really, there isn't anything else I feel it could reasonably be, so I'm just going to leave it at that. One thing that is plainly clear, however, is that the man on the radio seems to have some sinister ulterior motives. The fact that it's him speaking during these peaks in static, and that his tone of voice has shifted to something much more sinister, and even commanding, strongly implies that he was perhaps trying to get his viewers to obey him for reasons that aren't exactly what we in the intellectual world would call good. The man's clearly plotting something, but due to Silent Hills' cancellation, we'll never quite know it for ourselves. The subliminal messages seem to be planting seeds of doubt in the viewer, though, which is something that will develop in the next broadcast. The man says not to touch the dial and that we're just getting started, conveying to the hypothetical viewer that this is not something they should miss out on. However, the tone is extremely threatening, as if to imply, if you don't listen, you're going to be in trouble, when really the opposite's true. If you turn around when he tells you to, you'll more than likely be attacked by Lisa. The man's gone from being insensitive to victims of crimes to being an outright dick to the player. There's another much smaller radio transmission not long after the Look Behind You puzzle, when you first see the fridge hanging where the light once was. In this transmission, you hear the same guy from before saying the following.
After killing his family, the father hung himself with a garden hose in the garage.
Of course, if you listen carefully, you'll hear something else beneath this saying,
With a garden hose in the garage.
It appears to be the same voice as the prior radio broadcast, but modified to sound deeper. There are some implications here, but nothing really concrete. If we are to assume that the starting room is supposed to represent an actual room in the house, the only room that really makes sense is the garage. If that were to be the case, then it would explain why we start the game in that room and why we return there when we're killed by Lisa. Possible further evidence of this is how Lisa seems to target our neck specifically. This would also cause us as an audience to, had we not already thought to at this point, question whether or not our player character was even alive or not. Did the garden hose fail to get the job done? Are we perhaps in some sort of limbo between life and death where some of what we see is from the living world and others from the realm of the dead? That would certainly seem to fall in line with the happenings of Silent Hill. It's impossible to say for certain though, but it's certainly fun to explore, and I think there is some sort of implication here to suggest that the starting room is in fact meant to represent the garage. After all, the layout of the house isn't meant to make complete sense, as discussed previously. However, subtle and vague design choices are there so we can make inferences of our own, rather than definitive statements and conclusions, so I'll leave it up to the viewer what the deal with the starting room is, and whether or not the broadcast does pertain to the player character. After the Hell puzzle, we encounter another broadcast that is easily the most interesting of the bunch. The entire broadcast is delivered in Swedish, and translates as follows.
Close your eyes. Let your ears listen to the radio. Can you hear my voice? Can you hear your own soul scream? Let us choose. My voice that tells the future, or your tortured mind? Well, what do you choose? You can choose. Your life, your future. Wise as you are, you might already have discovered it. Yes, the radio drama from 75 years ago was true. They are here on our Earth, and they monitor and see all. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust the police. They are already controlled by them. That's the way it has been for 75 years now. Only our best will prevail. You have a right to become one of us. So, welcome to our world. Very soon the gates to a new dimension will open.
Så har det varit i 75 år nu. Endast vår mästare kan hålla dem. Du har en rätt. En rätt att bli en av oss. Så välkommen till vår. Mycket snart öppnas portarna till den nya.
204-863.
So there's quite a bit to unpack here. Doubling down on the idea that our main character's descent into madness included a deep dive into conspiracism, I think it's fair of me to conclude that this broadcast is meant to represent our main character's belief that not all is right with the world, all the while subtly hinting that his own mind is in fact quite damaged. The very first thing said in the broadcast is to close your eyes, let your ears listen to the radio. It's important to note that similarly to what was said by the mad lad Caruso in the Look Behind You broadcast, this is a direct command to the viewer. To close your eyes is to deprive yourself of one of your key senses, and to lend stronger focus to another key sense, which the radio then directly tells you to use to listen to it. Already this broadcast is suggesting that not only is the radio trying to control its viewers, but that it's trying to get the audience to rely on it. Finally, the line, "Do you hear my voice?" seems to be an attempt at focusing the viewer's attention solely on the radio. This even makes sense in the context of the game, because within this particular loop, Lisa is incapable of harming us, at least while the radio broadcast is going on. The radio then asks, "Can you hear your own soul scream?" This suggests that there is some sort of understanding that its viewers are struggling, perhaps hinting that the radio is preying on those struggling mentally, emotionally, or even spiritually. Also note how it asks "can" rather than "do." This suggests to the viewer that perhaps, if they cannot, it could be a weakness on their own part, thus leading them to seek further truth from the radio. The radio then says, "Let us choose. My voice that tells the future, or your tortured mind." Well, what do you choose? The radio is making an illusion of choice, implying to the viewer that they very well could ignore what it's saying, but to do so would be misguided as the radio speaks with a voice that tells the future, while the viewer suffers from a tortured mind. The question, well, what do you choose, is almost condescending at this point, thus leading the viewer to believe that they'd be foolish not to listen to the radio. Also, note how it says, let us choose, not make a choice, or something else to that effect. The following line, you can choose, your life, your future, reaffirms to the viewer that it is their choice what they do. Having torn the viewer's defenses down at this point in the monologue, the radio is now helping the viewer establish an entirely new foundation, thus strengthening their trust in the radio. The radio then uses this trust to reaffirm to the viewer that they are in some way special by saying, wise as you are, you might already have discovered it. Now that the radio has reestablished the psychological foundation of its viewers, it's ready to begin divulging its secrets, not unlike the methods used by cult leaders. Yes, the radio drama from 75 years ago was true. They are here on our Earth and they monitor and see all. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust the police. They are already controlled by them. That's the way it has been for 75 years now. The radio drama being referenced is the 1938 broadcast known as The War of the Worlds, where broadcaster Orson Welles directed a faux news broadcast touting that extraterrestrial life forms were invading Earth. This broadcast occurred on the night of October 30th and was simply intended to be a Halloween special. However, it soon blew up into something much more culturally significant than anyone behind it probably ever thought possible. The broadcast came under fire from other media outlets for allegedly convincing a number of viewers that aliens were actually invading. Something important to note is that the public outrage purported by the media has been highly debated over the years. So while Wells's broadcast was being touted as fake news, the very people making these reports were more than likely exaggerating things themselves. Even nearly a century ago, Americans were getting up in arms about the unreliability of the media. Ironic. Anyways, back to the broadcast in PT. The radio then goes on to tell its viewers not only that they can't trust anyone else, but it tells them not to. The radio says that's the way it has been for 75 years now, suggesting to the viewer that by now they, quote-unquote, have rooted deeply into our society. This, of course, is very relevant to our main character who is struggling to make sense of his firing, given what we know. At this point, it should be quite clear how this particular broadcast represents the psychological breakdown of our main character from his listenings of the radio. There are a couple of questions to address at this point. For starters, why is the broadcast in Swedish? Simply put, there's really no answer. It's possible that the main character, or even Lisa, descends from Swedish heritage. It's also possible that David Caruso just happened to know how to speak Swedish and Kojima thought it would be cool. There really is no answer. Sorry. Is this an actual broadcast that our main character is remembering and being faced with? Honestly, I don't think so. I think this broadcast is simply here to depict, as I've tried to present, how our main character was led to the radio and how it led to his distrust of Lisa. A distrust that unfortunately took a dark turn when he inevitably discovered the potential infidelity of his spouse. The final lines of the broadcast go as follows. Only our best will prevail. You have a right to become one of us. So welcome to our world. Very soon the gates to a new dimension will open. This is an attempt by the radio to hype up its viewers as they rally against the threat of society. This is a common practice for any speaker, whether they be legitimate leaders,
free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Or psycho cult leaders.
I truly believe that if we work together, we can create a cultural shift.
Whoops. That was supposed to be a Charles Manson clip. Well, all the same. Anyways, it's a solid way to cap off any sort of passionate speech, and it leaves the viewers feeling like they have a sense of responsibility that supersedes their cultural norms. Given what we heard earlier about fathers murdering their families and the potential that this was beginning to become something of a trend, it's quite possible, given what we now know, that the radio was inciting the actions taken by these people. In fact, I think it's all but directly said to us.
Okay, listen up, and don't you move. Need to take a piss? Hold it. The show's got just 60 seconds to go, but I got a message for all you folks out there in Radio Land. So sit tight and bend an ear. Now's the time for action. Our society is rotten to the core. I'm talking to all the fine, upstanding folks got their welfare cut, got their jobs pulled out from under them. Yeah, you know what to do. Now's the time. Do it.
That was the final broadcast in PT. In the game, we don't actually hear the opening lines of it, but thanks to data miners, I'm able to present it to you in full. given that this broadcast is given to us in the climax of what is essentially the story section of the game, it makes sense that we would be presented with a plot revelation or two, the other of course being what happened to Lisa, but more on that later. In this broadcast, we learn exactly what the man on the radio thinks of the society he lives in, and we learn that he was in fact inciting violence from his viewers. At the very least, we can confirm that the main character was in some way feeling incited by the radio, given what's going on during this broadcast. The radio in PT is a fascinating element of the story that I felt was going rather undiscussed. I scoured the internet for videos, articles, and threads discussing it, and there were certainly a handful of interesting interpretations I'd found from the fans, despite being so few and far between. Amongst these, my favorite had to be the video by RagnarRox where he discusses the possible connection between the radio in PT and the CIA Project MKUltra, where people were being brainwashed via radio broadcasts. It's a genuinely fascinating subject and perhaps something I'd want to explore in the future. For now, though, I think I'm satisfied with what I've discussed in this section of the essay. There's only one topic left for me to cover now, and that's Lisa. I can already tell that the Lisa video will probably be one of the biggest and meatiest of them all, so I'm eager to get right into it following this. After that, I'll have one more video, which will serve as the conclusion for the entire series. I want to go ahead and apologize that this video might be coming out a little bit later than I'd like. Unfortunately, I got pretty sick last week, and that took several days out of my schedule. My voice was messed up, so there was no way I was going to be able to record this and sound halfway decent. On the plus side, I was able to finish my Dead Space 4 video as well as the Layers of Fear video. Which, by the way, you should check out because, from what I've been told, my Dead Space 4 pitch was pretty good. And speaking from my own perspective, the Layers of Fear video was a blast. I really enjoyed making it. But I suppose that's enough self-promoting for now. I'm hoping to have the Lisa video out by the end of the next week, and I'm also wanting to do something special for Halloween. But until that time comes, my name is Loveless, and that was the radio in PT.
Your son. Send him on his way to heaven by your own hand. It's not too late if you act fast. You, what did you do? Right in front of everyone. I'm putting this on the news, you psycho murderer.